WTO, though, I mean, it was controversial. I mean, I've talked to some activists here who, I mean, and then that thought it was great that the Black Bloc did that because the WTO is completely disrupted and it brought to the world stage. Even Clinton was talking about it. But I was there, and somebody could easily got killed. I mean, one trigger had to be caught, and it was a very dangerous situation. That many people with tear gas going all over the place and rubber bullets and et cetera. And it's just a miracle nobody was killed. So I ended up going to Cancun in 2003 for another WTO meeting, and the Black Bloc was there again. This time, though, they weren't as effective because if any of you dealt with campesino protests, I don't know, has anybody here dealt with the campesinos in Mexico? They're very well organized and they're very peaceful, actually. They've had decades of experience. Yes, so the Black Bloc and some other outside groups were throwing rocks at the Mexican police that were manning a barricade at Cancun, and they were, they brought a wagon with a bucket of human waste, and they were like, throwing human waste at the Mexican cops. So it's an ugly scene. But the campesino leaders, after that, basically told these guys to knock the shit off, and they actually have their own security. It's like an unofficial internal security where they'll just take you aside. And so from that point on, even though Cancun ended up, they had a lot of internal arguments within the WTO, which the meeting ended up imploding. There were no more really violent protests there. But I came back to San Francisco and then the anti-war protests. So this was like day one after Bush invaded Iraq. And San Francisco was like ground zero of biggest demonstration I've ever seen, even bigger than Seattle. It was like tens of thousands. And the goal was to shut down San Francisco. And they blocked the intersections. It was everywhere through the Regime Grannies, the Queer Nation, Jews for Peace, every ACT UP, every group you've ever heard of. We want to ban circumcision now. And then of course the large anti-war groups, they were marching down Market Street in San Francisco. But it kind of got out of control. And in San Francisco, the San Francisco police, we talk a lot about police brutality. If you're an activist, go to San Francisco. That's the one place they're going to do pretty much whatever you want. I mean, they are the most mellow police force I've ever seen. I used to be a police reporter in Houston, Texas, and once wrote about a African-American man who was mentally deranged who threatened an officer with nunchucks, and there was like 20 officers shot him. He's like 30 or 40 shots. It was, and I was, the Black Bloc was active then too, and the day ended up being disrupted. There were, windows broken, people. There was a woman in a minibus that was trapped in an intersection for an hour, and she was yelling at the protesters like, "What the fuck are you doing? I work for a nonprofit. We don't like the war either. Why are you trying to punish us in San Francisco?" And so after that, the anti-war protests, I think they kind of heard that, and they started doing more targeted demonstrations. Bechtel is headquartered in San Francisco, so they started doing demonstrations more targeted against, the companies that were involved in the war. But then, that kind of brings us up to almost Occupy and Oscar Grant. I mean, you've all heard about Oscar Grant. 2009, unbelievable case, and this is where social media started to get really important. Oscar Grant was being detained on a subway platform in Oakland by a BART cop, the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, and they have tasers. They have a gun on one side and a taser on the other. And in those days, they were like the same color. And so there was a BART train with the door still open. It was packed. It was New Year's morning, like 2 a.m. And for whatever reason, it was never determined why, Johannes Messerly, the cop, pulled his service revolver, thinking it was a taser, shot Oscar Grant point blank and killed him in front of cell phone cameras and et cetera, et cetera. And there was actually, the cops were freaking out, and they tried to, there was actually a subway BART door closing, and as somebody's taking a cell phone, but they're going to, try to confiscate the cameras, and they couldn't. And so that was a huge protest over that, huge. And that's where the anarchists and and Oakland's had a history of police brutality problems, and so that they kind of joined forces, and so it became kind of a powder keg. And so, and it never was really resolved. And you know, every anniversary of Oscar Grant, there would be you know, more protests and marches and et cetera. And then to the point that we got Occupy, you know, the Occupy movement. And I covered Occupy SF. There's Occupy SF and Occupy Oakland. And the two were totally different. Occupy SF, it was, you know, organized by a guy named Pirate Mike. He called himself Pirate Mike. It was hippies and homeless, basically. And they had this giant encampment. And, you know, very mellow. They worked with the city of San Francisco. They actually said on the website, we work with the city of San Francisco. I'm not sure why they kept it. I guess they did that interesting stuff with Oakland. Oakland was totally different. Oakland was kind of ready for, I mean, they're not going to take any crap there. And Jean Quan, the mayor of Oakland, you guys heard of Jean Quan?
Yeah.
She, you know, and it's funny, she's a liberal Democrat. And she initially embraced the movement. She went out and gave a speech to them. And then turned the cops loose off, basically, you know. And within days. And, you know, they named their plaza, it was the City Hall Plaza, they named it Oscar Grant Plaza after Oscar Grant. And I have to say, though, that the, you know, the anarchists were ready for trouble, too. So whenever the cops, I mean, they moved in, cleared them out in October, they, you know, the anarchists were ready. And they had, there was a bottle throwing spree at one point. Scott Olson, the Marine veteran, was famously shot with a projectile and almost killed. He was hit in the head. He became like the figurehead of the movement then. So that led to the big shutdown. It was going to be the general strike. And I think I was talking to you. You were following this on. People were following this all over the country. It was going. Oakland was just turning into this meltdown. I was following it. I had a colleague that was, I mentioned Susie Cagle. She is one of the journalists, and she's an independent journalist, but she was like right there, not embedded with Occupy Oakland, but she was there all the time. And she was, I mean, there's Oak Faux Show, another one. There's this whole network of bloggers. I signed up with the Occupy Oakland Twitter feed. They're much more interested in Occupy SF. The Occupy SF were just smoking dope. They're having just a party basically. But anyway, the day of the general strike, they marshaled tens of thousands of people in Oakland to shut down the Port of Oakland. And it's actually not that hard to do. I mean, unlike Port of LA, which is there's freeways, it's not that easy to get to. The Port of Oakland's right next to downtown Oakland, so it's actually just like 2 or 3 roads. And it's pretty easy to shut down. And they did that. It was a great. There was no, the cops stayed back. They were totally, hands-free, hands-off at that point. And that night, there was a group. It was the Black Bloc. Maybe there's not that many, like 100 of them. But they took over a building and they started starting fires, and it turned into this unbelievable in LA. There was Molotov cocktails. There was, read what it was like. I mean, it was. I said, Oakland police and riot gear fired tear gas and beanbags to disperse a group of about 100 protesters before 1 a.m. Thursday. And this was after the tens of thousands had gone home. A lot of going to Oscar Grant Plaza, and they were kind of celebrating it. I mean, it had been a very successful operation. Police said officers were pelted with rocks, explosives, bottles, and flaming objects. Witnesses said explosives and Molotov cocktails. Police said they arrested dozens of protesters who were carrying shields. There's 2 sides of the story. I mean, the police were, the Oakland police were very aggressive also. But the anarchists were totally ready to take them on. So it's kind of a war going on here. And, I remember doing a story on the role of the Black Bloc after this. And I talked to, a lot of people within the movements that were not happy with, so why don't, you say it's going to be a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration. What happened? I mean, how can you? They said, we don't, and in some cases they were breaking the windows of businesses that were owned by mom and pop businesses. A lot of the Black Bloc violence is really vandalism on like Starbucks and Bank of America, just kind of corporate, big corporate names. But in Oakland, it actually started turning into just general vandalism. And a lot of people were getting really pissed off. But I interviewed one of the gurus of the movement, John Zerzan. And he's written for many decades, and he's kind of the intellectual guru of the modern anarchist movement, I think. And I asked him, what do you think about, what they're doing? And his quote was, targeted property damage and self-defense against cops I consider entirely justified and necessary. But he also pointed out that in the past it really hasn't been that effective as far as really changing agendas. After that, Occupy Oakland, there was Chris Hedges wrote in Truthbit, I guess, about Occupy, basically the death of Occupy Oakland. Occupy Oakland is dead, long live Occupy Oakland. And I remember seeing the rebuttals of it. Basically he's saying that the anarchists pretty much took over the movement. They kind of lost the public on that, and it became like a running battle between the Black Bloc and the police. And in some ways it was, because they had every week the FTP march, fuck the police. And I would follow that with Susie Cable. She was always on that, and she was getting cattled, and she got arrested, and just a couple of final points. And then Occupy SF started getting a little nasty towards the end. They finally moved in to take that encampment down. It was huge. It was like, I don't know, the whole Justin Herman Plaza practically was an encampment, and it turned as a major public safety issue, just like Kate was talking about in LA. And it was homeless. It was like, and they were having fights with homeless people, and they moved in and picked that down, and they ended up going through the streets of San Francisco. They took over a vacant building. One guy on a rooftop threw a piece of rebar out and almost hit somebody, the crowd. And I followed that one on live stream, and there was I forget what you call them, news streamers or. But anyway, there's the great thing about covering these movements now is that you can't be there. Like I could not be there physically. I was there earlier, but a lot of times the trouble happens late. Like
yeah.
You know what I mean? So I was getting obsessed watching. I was just following live stream like at home. Watching TV and watching live stream or checking the latest from Susie Cable. And that's kind of one way I kept up with what the latest was. And I had a colleague in Oakland who lived in Oakland near downtown Oakland, so we deployed him if something really big was happening. But at this point, I think it's still playing out, and as far as mainstream media, independent media, I think we're kind of all one and the same now, honestly. And as far as press credentials, mine hasn't been updated since 2008. I think so little of credentials that I don't bother. So.
Well, would you in New York? I'm just curious. Would you? Oh, wow.
Only the West Coast. No, I was not in New York at all.
No, but if you went now, knowing what you know, would you try to get something? Could the Wall Street Journal even give you a temporary one? Because I think they have them.
Do you have to have a credential at the New York?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm used to the West Coast where it's much more mellow out here.
No, they're really crazy about that.
So, so will they actually check the date and everything?
Well, if you have an NPPA one, yeah. Well, if it's a New York City one, they might not look at the date. But if they caught you when you were, they would be mad. When they do it, they do it.
Because this is SFPD, and it's just like a major hassle. They won't
No,
get.
they only want New York City. That's why they wouldn't credential me. Yeah. But I bet the Wall Street Journal could give you a temporary. Like
I guess if I had to, I would. But I just never. Nobody ever asked me for it. So
Wow.
I use my business card. Here's who I am. But honestly, I've mostly dealt with protesters. I just like Kate was saying, a lot of these people, I found really fascinating who really is an Occupy. And it was like people they come to the encampment during the day and they go home at night, or they go work during the day, and then come to the camp at night. And so the General Assemblies, I would usually count on Twitter feed to see what's going on there. And I could tell they're starting to fight amongst themselves too. Cable would have these posts of, so-and-so, now that, it's too patriarchal, too chauvinistic, putting down the women, it's too white. That was one complaint about the Occupy movement. Oakland's a very, heavily minority city, African American, a lot of Latinos, but it was like a lot of the protesters were white, and so those were some issues that played out in the General Assemblies, and so I didn't write about, just like Kate, I didn't really write about everything I saw on Twitter, but it gave me a good feel for what was going on, so.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, this is an area that I've studied both journalistically and as a social major, so like, I just thought it was important to point out, like, there's a lot of anarchists who are not, like, don't participate in Black Bloc. So I mean, it's not, like, I know a lot of anarchists who are, like, really friendly, gentle people and, like, are awesome. So I think the theory behind Black Bloc, like you were saying, is that violence is only something that can be done against a person. So they don't view breaking a window, like just because someone would break a window does not in any way mean that they would attack a person. So I think it's important to understand that it's not just total chaos. Like
But they have attacked photographers.
right. Well, in New York there were a few. Right, but that is relatively unusual. Usually they'll do it if they feel like you're trying to capture their identity or something. It is something to be aware of. But in general, like you should just know that the people in the mass do see a distinction between breaking a window and hitting a person. Like those are